You're listening to episode 103 of Bionic Planet, Season 9, entitled Purists, Pragmatists, and the Science-Based Targets Initiative.
80% of the companies that have ever committed to SBTI have done so since January 2023, which means they're not due to submit their plans until January 2025.
SBTI is the Science-Based Targets Initiative, a program created a few years back to help companies set emission reduction targets that align with the goal of reaching net zero emissions by 2050. Companies that sign up to SBTI have 2 years to submit a plan for getting there. But
their planning process hasn't yet been tested.
In episode 101 of Bionic Planet, we looked at Interface Carpets, a company that's been offsetting its emissions for over 20 years while it developed new manufacturing processes that, on balance, now end up pulling more greenhouse gas from the atmosphere than they emit. But most companies don't have Interface's track record or its expertise. And
the thing we have to remember is that there are fossil fuels embedded in every single aspect of most companies' value chains. It's very complicated.
Is it ever? Our entire civilization depends on fossil fuels, and Vaclav Smil, the great Canadian professor and philosopher of all things energy, says the average human today leverages 3,500 times more energy than did the average human of just 200 years ago. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, tells us we must reach net zero emissions globally by 2050 if we're to meet the climate challenge. And that means we have to squeeze all the greenhouse gas emissions we can out of the economy and use offsets to mop up the rest. But as companies that never before thought much about how to reduce emissions trip over each other with net zero commitments, most of them are finding they don't know how to get there, and a lot of them are quietly giving up. We obviously need governments to step up with mandatory caps, but we also need an on-ramp for companies to voluntarily go beyond what the law requires. How to get there?
A pragmatic approach would say, look, if you're in an industry where the next least costly abatement action is going to cost you more than it would cost to purchase an offset, then you should go ahead and buy the offset, and you should compensate for all of your emissions using offsets for the remainder.
But SBTI in its guidance doesn't recognize the use of offsets, or didn't until recently, when it started doing so, but only for Scope 3 emissions. Quick reminder, there are 3 kinds of emissions. Scope 1 emissions are the ones that come directly from a company's own operations, like their vehicles or boilers. Scope 2 emissions are the emissions from energy they buy, like electricity or heating. Scope 3 emissions cover everything else, like the emissions from their suppliers, the transportation of their products, or even their employees commuting to work. Recognizing Scope 3 emissions kicked off a firestorm within the SBTI, which we'll cover in a later episode. Today's guest, Jen Jenkins, would say that those who oppose the use of offsets aren't pragmatists. They're purists.
Mm-hmm. The purist approach would say, no, I need to hold everybody's feet to the fire and ensure that no matter how much it costs, ensure that these companies sort of suss out every single source of fossil fuel in their value chain and obliterate it immediately, but no company is going to voluntarily sign up to destroy value in its operations.
Today, in our continuing look at the tribes of the climate realm, purists, pragmatists, and the SBTI.
Man may be unwittingly changing the world's climate through the waste products of his civilization.
There's a group of us now who are proposing that the Earth has actually entered a new epoch, and that is the Anthropocene.
We know that the enemy is carbon, and we know its ugly face. We should put a big fat price on it. And of course, add to that, drop the subsidies.
Earth, we broke it, we own it. And nothing is as it was. Not the trees, not the seas, not the forests, farms, or fields. And not the global economy that depends on all of these. But we can restore it, make it better, greener, more resilient, more sustainable. But how? Technology? Geoengineering? Are we doomed to live on a bionic planet, or is nature herself the answer? That's the question we address in every episode of Bionic Planet, a podcast of the Anthropocene, the new epoch defined by man's impact on Earth. And today we examine it through the eyes of Jen Jenkins, famous to many of us in the land use space as the person for whom the Jenkins equations are named. Those equations provide a standardized way of estimating the carbon stock of a forest, which is a subject I've covered quite a lot on the show, most recently in episode 82 with Sasan Sachi, entitled Every Tree on the Planet Mapped. In today's show, Jen discusses the challenges of reducing internally and the balance between pragmatism and purity.
I'm Jen Jenkins. I'm the Chief Science Officer at Rubicon Carbon. Rubicon is a fairly new entity in the voluntary carbon market space. We're an integrated carbon credit management firm, and we serve the entire carbon credit supply chain, from sort of investments in projects to packaging credits into portfolios that we sell, something called the Rubicon Carbon Ton. So on the science team, I'm broadly responsible for the quality and integrity of the credits that we bring into the portfolio and for the ongoing monitoring and risk adjustment, sort of active management process that we undertake to ensure quality for our customers.
Okay. And how did you become the Chief Science Officer? What's your background?
I started my career in science. I have a PhD in ecosystem ecology and natural resources, and I studied forest atmosphere carbon exchange as a student, and really always was interested in policy in the sense that it was important to me that my science be applicable. People needed to be able to use my work to create policies that would, make the world a better place. And I cared deeply about the environment and about the impacts of climate change. I actually graduated in the 20th century with my PhD. So maybe before climate change was cool, people were not as agitated, I guess, about it as they are now, although maybe they should have been. So I proceeded through my career in government and academia for probably, I'd say, 20 years, and enjoyed all of that. I loved government, I loved academia, I loved the flexibility, but I really found that I was hungry for impact. And so in 2015, 2016 was sort of when the ESG revolution in the private sector was sort of taking off. And I actually went back to school and got my MBA and graduated in 2016. And from there, pivoted into the private sector and never looked back. It's been fun. I've had chief sustainability officer roles in a couple of different organizations. Have been in the voluntary carbon market for, I'd say, the last 3 years or so.
Okay. You start out with this science background in ecosystems and interaction with the atmosphere, and then you get into general ESG, and you became more and more narrow, and then you ended up becoming focused on the voluntary carbon market. What drew you into this particular space?
It's funny. I mean, people talk about academics and they say, the key in academia, what happens to you as you, go through your career in academia is you learn more and more about less and less until eventually you know everything about nothing.
Yeah.
And I think for a lot of academics, that's probably true. I have always been more interested in sort of synthesis and integration and how do all the pieces fit together, right? If that makes sense. And it was kind of a short hop for me, honestly, to go from the science and the government work I was doing at the US EPA. I was working on writing policy for bioenergy facilities to be used in the Clean Air Act, right? Like, how do you count the CO2 emissions when you burn wood in a power plant? How do you do that? Because arguably, wood burning ought to be carbon neutral, right? And so we were trying to figure out how do you sort of fit that into the narrow confines of the existing law, and you do it in a way that makes it impervious to lawsuits and all the rest. I ended up in the carbon market just, at Envivo, where I had been chief sustainability officer, was my first private sector role. We committed to be net zero in our operations, by which we meant scope 1 and 2. And as part of that process, I became much more familiar with sort of what was happening in the carbon market at that time, which was 2020 and 2021. But really, the work that I had done earlier, probably 20 years before, on quantifying forest biomass right? The reason that was interesting to me was because creating a consistent national scale biomass estimation technique was absolutely critical to understanding how could we monetize carbon storage. It had to be consistent across state lines, right? And so in 2003, together with colleagues, I published a paper in Forest Science, this now fondly referred to as the Jenkins equations, that are used as sort of the basis and the foundation for diameter-based biomass estimation for things like carbon projects.
It's funny. I forgot that you were the Jenkins behind the Jenkins equations, because I remember learning that when I took my
Yeah.
class on UCSD and on how to do forest carbon accounting and everything.
Right.
Yeah.
I think it's funny. I think people think, well, gosh, that was 20 years ago. It must be some like old wizened,
Yeah.
person who's long retired, right? But I did that. I was pretty early career at that time, so
Yeah.
I'm still
Yeah. You
around.
must have been a kid. I was.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I pictured some old guys. Yeah. Because you don't even see first names in those
Right.
things. And okay, so that's really. And
No, yeah. No, I had a great group of colleagues too. It was a fun team.
Yeah. You touched on all the issues we kind of want to get into. This issue of narrow versus integrated, I think, is the big theme. And then net zero, the fact that you started to get involved with net zero back in 2020, because I think back in 2020, there still wasn't this clear distinction between net zero and carbon neutral. Because I think nowadays, I'm not sure quite when that distinction crystallized. Maybe it was before, maybe it was after, but now there's this clear emphasis on net zero being the end goal, where we're supposed to end up in the year 2050. And in most of the literature I read, they emphasize the fact that it's a global objective, not a company objective. But the idea is that we get to the point where the global economy has squeezed out all of the emissions that it can squeeze out, and it's only using carbon markets to remove the residual emissions, to take out what's left. So we've got kind of a paradox here. We've got net zero, which is an objective that we have to be at in 2050. Then we've got how do companies go from here to there? And then the other is how do we accelerate this globally? I see reduction-based carbon credits as a way of accelerating the whole global race to zero, even if a reduction-based emission offset can't be applied to a net zero target. It gets really confusing here and kind of hairy. But when you came into this space in 2019 and you were looking at net zero, how were you viewing the concept of net zero at that point? Were you kind of seeing it as offsets for the here and now, or were you looking at them as a tool for getting to net zero?
There are, and there were at that time, very few clear rules for how companies could articulate their commitments. And there are so many different kinds of companies with so many different kinds of cultures and so many different kinds of manufacturing operations, or even whatever, so many different industries, that it was, and I think it still is, very hard to have sort of a one-size-fits-all rule.
Yeah.
So what we knew was that we had to choose a commitment that we felt good about making because it was going to work for us, right? And so, for example, we did not include Scope 3 in our original commitment. We knew we weren't going to be able to quantify our Scope 3 emissions. The methods just weren't there. And I had like a team of one. I had one analyst whose job was to help with all of this stuff. And he did a great job, fantastic, but he's only one person. And so it wasn't going to be possible for us to put together an appropriate Scope 3 inventory. We just didn't have it. We hadn't collected the data that way.
Right.
People just don't, right? That you need to transform your entire accounting system and the underlying CRM that you use to manage all your data. You need to change how you organize all of your corporate record keeping in order to accurately assess a Scope 3 inventory. So in that manufacturing firm, super interesting, right? We knew our Scope 1 emissions were from natural gas that was used to fire the regenerative thermal oxidizer that was an integral part of the air pollution control system. And our permits for production were dependent on the operation of that particular unit.
Well, you gotta love the irony, right? They generated their Scope 1 emissions running the system that eliminated their air pollution. They can't just shut that off, and they couldn't find a cost-effective alternative that keeps them competitive. If they're not competitive, they're just giving an advantage to companies that don't even try to cut emissions. I'm in a similar situation with Bionic Planet. Producing this show isn't economically sustainable the way I'm doing it right now, namely without support. If you like what you hear and you want more and better episodes, you can help me deliver them by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Bionic Planet. That's patreon.com/Bionic Planet. Bionic Planet, all one word, no dots or dashes. You can also help me by becoming a sponsor. If you're an ethical business looking to reach a global, climate-aware audience, email me at steve@bionic-planet.com. That's steve@bionic-planet.com to learn about sponsorship packages. To really scale the show up, I need to spend a lot less time on other work and more on the show, and I also need to hire a skilled sound designer who can take the editing tasks. That's because every hour I spend editing is an hour I don't spend researching, writing, or interviewing, all crucial for helping you navigate the new reality of life on a managed planet. Now back to Jen Jenkins, who was explaining the challenge she faced cutting emissions to meet an earlier net zero goal.
And so in order for us to continue operating, we needed to continue using natural gas, which was going to continue emitting Scope 1 emissions.
Right.
And millions of dollars of capital expenditures had been spent on that equipment, right, to upgrade the facility so that we could continue operating appropriately and within the scope of our permit. So there was a lot of interest among the engineering team to find other ways of destroying the air pollutants so that we wouldn't need to use the RTOs. But you just can't sort of go around disrupting a manufacturing operation like that.
Mm-hmm.
It's uncertain. You don't know how it's going to work. You have to sort of do the pilot test on the equipment and see, work on the chemical means of destroying the pollutants. And is that going to be compatible with the ultimate end product that you're trying to create? And, it just wasn't feasible.
Mm-hmm.
So we ended up switching to a renewable natural gas option in some of our facilities because that was an option. There was a local producer of renewable natural gas. And so that was a great option, right, for that particular company. But it was also very, custom.
Mm-hmm.
So we were looking at the same time at purchasing renewable electricity for the Scope 2 emissions. And we didn't want to just get unbundled RECs because that's not viewed as, first class. But at the same time, it's complicated to get a virtual power purchase agreement and in your rural areas for the manufacturing facility. So it's not that easy.
Right.
And so we knew, right, that we were going to need to buy offsets to get to zero emissions, whether it's carbon neutral or net zero in our operations, by which we were defining, as I said, just, Scope 1 and Scope 2. And we gave ourselves until 2030 to make that happen. But we did it in a way that was very bespoke and customized. And
you did it through a combination of reducing internally as you were able to without just killing the company, in which case a good company is exiting.
Right.
And the goal was to be totally at emissions neutral by 2030, not right now, not in the current.
Right, by 2030 to net it out, right? Basically to say we're going to squeeze as many emissions as we can out of the system, and then we're going to buy offsets to compensate for the rest. And then we'll be essentially at carbon neutral, right? Or zero.
Right.
We'll be able to count ourselves as being as carbon neutral, zero emissions.
Yeah. And in today's nomenclature, we would call that carbon neutral because net zero is something much more specific. And it's where you've squeezed out all the emissions that we can, and we're only using carbon credits to offset those that we can't eliminate. And the distinction at net zero is that the only credits being used are the removal credits. And now we've got this whole debate going on. It centers around the SBTI, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which came out with this idea that we're going to create a net zero standard. And it's because we're emphasizing net zero, and again, net zero very specifically meaning that we're emphasizing that endpoint where everything's been squeezed out that can be squeezed out, and offsets are only being used to remove what's left. They explicitly prohibited the use of offsets in getting there, and they emphasized this idea of looking at the end goal and then coming up with interim targets that companies could achieve on the way towards eliminating internally. And it seems that by actively discouraging the use of offsets in the interim, they felt they were going to help focus people on the end result. That seems to be what I think they were trying to achieve. My feeling is that actually has the opposite effect in a lot of ways, because if you're offsetting everything now, you're much more currently focused on the fact that I have this cost as long as I'm continuing to emit, and then you're also constantly accounting for it. How do you see SBTI's objective of prohibiting offsets, and how does that impact the decision making inside of a company?
I'm reluctant to speak to what SBTI has in mind, so I won't, right? Except just to point out that the IPCC, right, has created a proposed trajectory for global emissions reductions that are required, and that the state of reaching net zero is what IPCC has laid out as being necessary in order to hold Earth and Earth's atmosphere to a reasonable degree of warming, and not to continue warming past the baked in warming that we already have, which is likely to continue past 2050, given the emissions that are currently in the atmosphere. So that is what the IPCC has said, right? There's sort of a trajectory that globally society needs to meet. And reaching that state of net zero is the end point. It's the desired end goal, where any residual emission is counterbalanced by a permanent removal, and we're adding no net new greenhouse gas to the atmosphere. That's something we can all agree on, right? The issue is, how do we get there, right? What's the sort of best way to hold ourselves accountable for doing that, right? And there really wasn't a standard. It wasn't clear what companies needed to do in order to sort of get to the end. There were no guidelines, and that's kind of what companies need, because they need a benchmark, right? They sort of need something that someone else has said this is good. So in order to understand sort of the approach that companies have taken to SBTI, we need to understand how companies think. First, why are they setting SBTI targets at all? They're responding to stakeholder pressure in many cases. I mean, some of them are some of them legitimately, it might be internally driven, right? Maybe from the leadership has a special focus on climate change, or it's a certain kind of industry that really, where that makes a lot of sense. But in many cases, it's going to be stakeholder driven. It's going to be perception. It's going to be marketing. It's going to be the investors saying, in order for you as a company to be eligible for any of the sort of ESG funds or other benefits that might accrue to you as a company with a target, or even for us as an investor to be interested in you, we need to know that you are committed to doing the hard work of mitigating the emissions in your own value chain. And so in order for us to know that, we need you to make an SBTI commitment. So then the company says, okay, great. And they begin the process of working with SBTI. So that the company is going to propose a trajectory for emissions. Ideally, the company has a greenhouse gas inventory, and they are, going through the process of figuring out how aggressively they can reduce over how many years, over how long a time. And then they will submit that, sort of proposal to SBTI as their science-based target. Now, and there's a lot of steps in the process, and I'm not the best person to sort of walk you through exactly what SBTI requires and the timeline. I do know that companies that commit to SBTI have 24 months from when they say they're committed to when they have to submit a plan. And that right now, actually, about 90% of the companies that have ever committed to SBTI are still pending, right? So that means 88% from our numbers, 88% of the companies that have ever committed to SBTI have done so since January 2023, which means they're not due to submit their plans until January 2025. So they're in a way, their planning process hasn't yet been tested.
Right.
Okay, so the way it works for a company is they're going to say, okay, we've heard from our stakeholders, we believe it's important. We're not quite sure how we're going to get there, but we know we have 2 years to figure it out, and so we're just going to go ahead and commit to SBTI. We're going to say we have this commitment, and then we can tell our investors and our stakeholders, and then we've got 2 years grace period to kind of figure it out. And then they begin the process, the difficult process of figuring out where in their value chain their emissions are coming from.
Mm-hmm.
And, the thing we have to remember is that there are fossil fuels embedded in every single aspect of most companies' value chains. It's very complicated to figure this out, right? And so what needs to happen inside a company is first figure out where the fossil fuels were coming from.
Right.
And then they have to figure out what the options they might have for mitigating sort of process by process each ton of CO2 equivalent and how much it's going to cost, right? And so they're basically going to do a marginal abatement curve, and you've seen these, right? McKinsey has done these for years, where they're going to say it's going to cost us, X dollars a ton to change out the light bulbs in our warehouse, or X dollars a ton to switch our delivery vehicles from, fossil fuel over to electric. And that's not trivial, right? Because if they switch over to electric, they're going to have to install charging. They're going to have to replace all the equipment. There's a lot, and there might be time involved in charging. You have to now have maybe more delivery people because you're going to have to spend some time charging if they have to charge, during the day. It's complicated. That's the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah.
And depending on the industry, some of these steps that need to be taken are going to be very costly. Right. So in some of the harder to abate industries, for example, McKinsey pointed out that many of these emissions reduction technologies are, not very well developed and currently cost about $3 or $4 or in some cases $500 a ton. So to implement those in one of these cases would be, frankly, value destroying.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Not value creating, value destroying, right? And so what you need to do is imagine yourself in the boardroom of one of these companies advocating for a decarbonization plan, right? And you're going to get to a certain point where the board is going to say, I can take all the steps that are going to save me money. Those are easy. Actually, most cases, people have already done those already. Those are done. Yeah. So I'm willing to invest up to the point where I feel like I can do it and it's worthwhile without sort of destroying further value. Mm-hmm. But we need to keep in mind that all of this activity is right now voluntary. So the company, even if they've made an SBTI commitment, that commitment itself is a voluntary commitment. Nobody is making them do it. They're doing it because they want to, and they are not going to voluntarily sign up to lose money.
Because that's suicide. I mean, if it was a compliance thing and all the competitors were doing it, and maybe it should be, but it's not.
But it's not, right? Mm-hmm. And that process, I guess, when you think about why is it that SBTI making offsets prohibited is causing companies to walk away from the offsets market? Well, because if you sign up to SBTI commitment, you can take 2 years to just kind of figure out your process, right? And then during that 2-year period, you really don't have any obligations at all. You're sort of free to just do all your planning. But the rubber really meets the road when you have to submit your plan for how you're going to meet your target. And I think at that point, what has been happening, frankly, is that a lot of companies are saying, we can't get there without the use of offsets. So we're just not going to submit a target or not going to submit our plan. And SBTI, per its rules, then kind of has to kick those companies off the island. Mm-hmm. And so those are the companies that have had their commitments removed, if you will.
You talked before about purity, or what did you say? Pragmatism versus purity, or pure. And
Yeah,
I think
purist versus pragmatist. That's right. Yeah, yeah.
we're saying if you want to come join us, you've got to be absolutely untouchably pure. But very few people are going to achieve that. They're shrinking the island when they should be expanding it.
Right, exactly. So I really like that sort of distinction between the purists and the pragmatists. It's two different approaches for two different ideas, I suppose, about how we can reach the same goal. We all want to get there. We're
Mm-hmm.
all motivated to get to net zero, but a pragmatic approach would say, look, if you're in a industry where the next least costly abatement action is going to cost you more than it would cost to purchase an offset, then you should go ahead and buy the offset and you should compensate for all of your emissions using offsets for the remainder.
Mm-hmm.
That's the pragmatic approach. And the reason it works is because the atmosphere doesn't care.
Mm-hmm.
As long as a ton is a ton, right? And that's a whole different story, right? But as long as a ton is a ton and we're using quality projects with quality credits, the atmosphere, it really doesn't matter to the atmosphere whether that abatement takes place here or in Illinois or in Bangladesh
Mm-hmm.
or in Australia or New Zealand or any other country. It doesn't matter, right? The atmosphere is well mixed. We need to reduce emissions globally.
Mm-hmm.
The purist approach would say, no, no, I need to hold everybody's feet to the fire and ensure that no matter how much it costs, ensure that these companies sort of suss out every single source of fossil fuel in their value chain and obliterate it immediately, no matter how much it costs. But no company is going to voluntarily sign up to destroy value in its operations.
Right. Right. Yeah.
I mean, then the other issue with not using offsets, is about 15% of our global emissions today are coming from forest conversion, particularly in tropical nations. And if our goal is to get to a point where we're not adding more carbon into the atmosphere, we're simply not going to get there if we
Yeah.
keep losing forests at that rate. And the voluntary carbon market right now, in the near term, is a fantastic way to help conserve those existing forests so that we retain both their carbon stocks and the important biodiversity that ensures that we're going to be living on an earth that we all want to live on in the future.
Yeah, and to me at times it seems that the purist versus pragmatist approach is about the old net zero versus carbon neutral, or at least what we used to call carbon neutral thing. That term kind of fell out by the wayside. For reasons I'd say are more about perception than reality. But net zero is the end point in theory. That's where we need to arrive worldwide by 2050, and carbon neutral was always about the here and now. If you say that a company is on course to achieve net zero alignment for itself by 2050, you should also give it room to be carbon neutral now, because everything that goes into the air has to be sucked out down the road, and anything that they're contributing to reductions globally is actually contributing to global net zero. I mean, the problem with carbon neutral is we had no agreement on what constitutes carbon neutrality. And the VCMI, I think the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative or somebody like that could maybe be, okay, hey, we're here to find agreement on what constitutes a legitimate claim in the here and now, and then the company can also have two objectives: a net zero commitment for its own alignment, and a carbon neutral commitment where it says we're netting out our current emissions and in so doing contributing to global net zero. Or is that one of those things that's it can kind of start to sound good in theory if we're sitting in the climate echo chamber, but somebody standing in the consumer aisle looking at two loaves of bread, and he's trying to figure out, gee, I mean, what's all? Then you've got RSPO for palm oil, FSC for timber and pulp, and I mean, at some point we have to think of how it's being communicated.
Yeah. Well, the added complication is that the word carbon neutral now, unfortunately, has sort of gotten a bad name,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so there is a lot of concern that use of that term is sort of covering up greenwashing or, the use of poor quality credits just to sort of get to a carbon neutral end point. The US government earlier this week made a strong show of support for the voluntary carbon market. And one of the things that Janet Yellen said and emphasized strongly was that the government and she and the Biden administration applaud companies that are sort of engaging in the market right now and using credits to help address their emissions and compensate for their emissions and hold themselves accountable for their emissions, right? Because so many companies are not doing that right now. And I think companies definitely should be rewarded for taking action, not dragged into court for taking action that is, viewed as, subpar. Companies should be taken to court for lying, but I don't think these companies are lying.
Right.
They're using best information available at the time. And in many cases, what happened was a project later, with the benefit of hindsight and extra technology and additional monitoring, was found not to have achieved its full effect. And that's something that Rubicon is addressing through our risk adjustment process. But there needs to be more flexibility, right, for companies that are following the rules at the time to have their processes in a way sort of grandfathered in, right? You can't go back.
Right.
No other market works like that. You can't go back, right, and sort of change the rules after the fact. It doesn't work. But to your point, what you suggest could work, right? Is there a carbon neutral sort of intersection or, merge onto the highway of net zero, We do have a problem with complexity. We have a problem with too many acronyms. We have a problem with a lack of confidence and trust right now.
Yeah, and to me, a big part of that goes back to the whole purist versus pragmatist separation, because I do think the purists have just been better at communicating, because pragmatism is about probabilities, uncertainties. Science itself is not about absolutes. It's about finding the concurrent views of most experts. And we take action based on what most experts say works, and we keep getting better and better at it. And if somebody used chemotherapy before we had immunotherapy to treat cancer, we just have to use the tools we have, and we have to make an agreement, move forward. What I see happening over and over again is that the companies that put their necks out to do something, they get their heads chopped off.
Yeah.
And
Sure.
the same thing happened in the deforestation movement, where the companies that made commitments to eliminate deforestation from their supply chains made huge strides towards doing so, but they often fell short of their commitments, and they got torn apart by certain NGOs. Whereas the companies that just laid low and did nothing, nobody bothered them. Some companies would split into good companies and bad companies, You have to draw red lines somewhere, someplace. But then you also have to have carrots and sticks, and you have to have a way to say, okay, we're trying to encourage you to go above and beyond. And that has to be rigorous enough to ensure that good is happening, but it can't be prohibitive or nobody's going to do it. So many things that look great on paper and never get done. Any advice on how we can find that sweet spot, that middle ground?
Yeah, no, I think you just said it perfectly, right? We kind of need to use the tools we have. We need to address the problem with what we've got at hand. And I think that's a very pragmatic look at the problem, right? I think what we're finding is that if you do take a purist view, especially in an environment and a market that is voluntary, you're not going to get the action you need, right? If we want climate impact coming from the private sector in today's political climate, we're going to have to make it easier. We're going to have to make it easy and accessible. And I firmly believe that the voluntary carbon market is one way to do that.
Jen Jenkins of Rubicon Carbon closing out this edition of Bionic Planet. And we're going to pick this theme up pretty soon with Bill Bowie, one of the people who launched the SBTI, and we'll offer more insight into how they got started, how they work, and what the current controversy is all about. If you like what you hear and you want more and better episodes of Bionic Planet, you can help me deliver them by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Bionic Planet. That's patreon.com/Bionic Planet. There you can support the show for as little as $1 per episode and with a monthly cap. You can also help by becoming a sponsor of Bionic Planet. If you're an ethical business, Looking to reach a global, climate-aware audience? Email me at steve@bionic-planet.com to learn about sponsorship packages. By the way, if you want to do that as a large donation, I am registered as a 501c3 nonprofit through my partnership with Manga Bay. That means donations are tax deductible. To really scale the show up, I need to spend less time on other work and more on the show. And I also need to hire a skilled sound designer who can take the editing tasks. That's because every hour I spend editing is an hour I don't spend researching, writing, or interviewing, all crucial to helping me help you navigate the new reality of life on a managed planet. That's all for today. Until next time, I'm Steve Zwick in Chicago. Thanks for listening.